and start with the perfect piece to start with. Because this piece is extremely minimal in its material and allows us to see composition as it's put into work. We're looking at how a composer can take something very simple and somehow make an experience out of it. And what gives us that experience is the structure, the composition, the way things are arranged and ordered and create a structure. So even though Gounod may have put an Ave Maria over this, I think that kind of missed the point. I think this piece is just to be observed in its pure state, so that we can enjoy all those things about it. And one of the things is its actual material, which seems extremely simple, but it's fascinating, because I think the idea of having the two sustained notes and the little arpeggio figure, and of course the rhythm of it, a little three note, da 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 da. You get a very interesting rhythm, you get a fascinating texture, which if you put the pedal down, you lose. What's interesting about this is that these tones that are being sustained can sometimes be extremely close and dissonant. It's a fascinating kind of sound that sometimes I think we're so used to hearing this piece, we don't realize how sort of wacky that approach to the sound world can be. So that's point number one. Point number two is the range factor. Because this piece simply is organized around starting high and ending up low. You see at this point, this little black box is exactly one octave lower than where we started, and everything else is sort of leading us to that point. And at the end of the piece, finally achieving the low pedal tone. So you can't talk about this piece, you can't experience this piece without feeling that the main overall drift of it is this descent from something very high and bright and something that goes lower and lower, finally ending up in rich bass range. Another point is repetition, which we'll find in a lot of very sophisticated ways in Bach's music. For example, this little two-bar unit is repeated a step lower. So there's something that I put in my jargon, a sequence, which you can't talk about Bach without talking about sequences. And sequences appear on all sorts of levels. Like we can see them here on a very short level, and then the blue stuff I'm about to talk about is on a very large level. The first one, that little two-chord progression is repeated down a step. So we get a sense of material being repeated, but as it's repeated, it's changing its color because of the way when you shift something, not only does the height, the range of the notes change, the color just changes because the keyboard's a little bit lower, but also the intervals sometimes can be transmuted because of how diatonic sequencing changes those relationships. But what happens at this point, the last thing of the yellow two-measure sequence material is also the first measure of a long four-measure blue idea. And that music comes exactly back, exactly transposed, a fifth lower, starting right here. So that's the kind of thing we find in a lot of these pieces. And there's something interesting about that, because not only does it sort of give us comparisons of large sections of the piece, but also gives us some tonal things to look at. And I think that's sort of my cue to get into one of the things that I have to talk about in talking about any music, as far as how its harmonic structure, I think, is conveying things to the listener. And that's something I call the spectrum of fifths. In almost all music theory lessons, we're taught about the particular orientation for this is what I call the spectrum of fifths. I think there's some magical thing that goes on in the way we're hardwired our ears to recognize certain kinds of ratios in sound frequencies. Obviously, when we hear something double the frequency, that's what we call an octave. And we take it for granted that everybody can hear octaves. But that's kind of an interesting thing, that human beings somehow have a very good ability to recognize that 2-to-1 ratio orally. I don't think we're so good at that with our eyes or with any other way of measuring, feeling like what is actually twice this. I can't really, but I can hear it, and I think anybody can hear it very precisely. Not only that, but there are other ratios like 1-to-3, which are also extremely readily heard by almost anybody who listens to music, and 3-to-2, which is just a sort of a simplification of that into something that stays inside an octave. That's the perfect fifth. My feeling is that there's something about hearing that perfect fifth that everybody can recognize and intuitively not only hears that that's a perfect fifth, that's a 3-to-2 ratio, but here's a certain kind of meaning behind those pitches, a relationship behind those pitches, which then gets involved in how we listen to almost everything we listen to. And that meaning is that we always hear the second part. I guess we'll use this chart. The next one, perfect fifth above any given note, as the note that's born from that note. We have the ancestor and the progeny, or the parent and the child. And I'll be talking about parents and childs and great-grandparents and great-grandchildren a lot, because I think that we recognize these relationships, and it creates the way we have organized a lot of our structure in music. For example, a pentatonic scale is 5 very closely related notes, adjacent notes, in this spectrum. And it can be all black notes, or it can be the white pentatonic set. But it's not just a bunch of 5 notes. There are notes that have a relative significance. So inside a pentatonic set, C is the great-great-grandfather, the one from which everything else comes. And as we move towards the sharp side, and I suggest that this entire thing goes towards sharp infinity and towards flat infinity, and we're just listening to some segment in the middle of it. As we move towards the sharp side, we start feeling that these notes have a lot brighter sort of, they're the new generation that comes out of the old folks here at the bottom. And we get to a diatonic set, we've got that same kind of issue. A diatonic set, a major scale, key signature, tells us 7 notes that are adjacent, related by a tritone on either end. On one end is the very flat note, on the other end is the very sharp note. And inside any kind of major scale, these notes have a lot of significance. We hear certain notes as having roles that they play because of where they are in this whole life expectancy thing of the father, the son, the parent, the grandparent. So that's a very, very quick exposition of that. So when we